Good afternoon, or should I say, Ellen Sila Lumen Omentielvo. I'm Don Boozer, the manager of the literature department and the coordinator of the Ohio Center for the Book here at Cleveland Public Library.
And I'm Sarah Flynn. I'm the manager of the Popular Library.
And as you may have noticed, we started with an Elvish greeting today. So today's episode is inspired by the upcoming premiere of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power on September 2nd. I'm sure if any of you are fantasy or sci-fi fans, you may be aware of this. It's only been talked about for the last 5 years, I think.
Yes.
So we have a number of series that we want to talk about today that are based on books, upcoming TV series. But what we wanted to do was sort of use this as a jumping off point and not make it so much of a reader's advisory or here's some titles to read, but sort of look at the behind the scenes idea of world building and both in sci-fi and fantasy and what goes into that, what makes a believable world and all that sort of thing. So I think that this will be an interesting freewheeling conversation.
Yeah.
So I am a self-avowed Tolkien nerd. Maybe not at the level of Stephen Colbert. I did not know the name of Arundel's ship whenever he asked the panel whenever he was on one of his appearances. But I have been a Tolkien nerd since high school. I am one of those people who read the appendices multiple times. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the Amazon series, that they only have access legally, from what I understand, to the Lord of the Rings and the appendices.
I didn't know that.
So I think that's so, and so I went back and I looked. I was just curious to see. So here is the final volume of the Lord of the Rings, and one interesting little piece of trivia too, that the Lord of the Rings is not technically 3 books. They did that for marketing purposes, and they didn't think anybody was going to buy a 900-page book. So let's split it into 3. And Tolkien was like, no, okay, you're the publisher, so whatever. So this is like a third of the actual book. But if you look here, these are the appendices in the back of the book. There are 127 pages, starting with the Númenórean kings and going on from there. So that was the level of notes that the Tolkien put in. There's also an index. There aren't too many fiction books that have an index.
No.
so this was the level of backstory that Tolkien was working with.
And that's all that Amazon has the rights to.
That's all they technically have the rights to.
Wow.
So the interesting thing is that Tolkien's son Christopher came out with a whole series of the history of Middle Earth, which this is volume 5. I think there's 6 or 7 volumes of this. So this is all of his notes and all of that sort of thing. So this one here, the Lost Road, talks about languages and the peoples and that sort of thing. So this is just one volume of that. So they don't technically have the rights to the material that's in here, which fleshes out a lot of the Second Age and all that sort of thing. So they're sort of working with one hand tied behind their back. So some of you may have noticed also the vitriol that's been spewed online about this upcoming series.
And for any series that has anything different from
any sort of fandom, exactly. Yep, exactly.
Been awful lately, and
so I think that everybody just needs to take a breath and go from there. So a lot of the people who are up in arms, have read, of course, every volume of the history of Middle Earth and all this sort of thing. I was like, well, that's not exactly. Well, it's let's cut them some slack and let's at least see how it is. But this is the history of Middle Earth is basically the extended appendix of the Lord of the Rings. So it's an interesting thing that we find. But a lot of people are saying, oh, they're going to ruin Tolkien. And I'm like, we have the books. I mean, we have the Peter Jackson films. I mean, and I'm sure there are going to be some good points in the series too. So I think we should at least give it a little bit of a break.
So I'm wondering, if Amazon has so much money, why couldn't they get the rights?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether there was any that they were possibly, maybe they were holding them back and saying, it's like, well, we'll see how you do, and then we'll see, maybe next year
they'll actually get more rights.
Exactly.
Oh, geez.
Exactly. But the fact that there is such a backstory and everything, even with that amount of information, there's still a lot. There's also a lot of stuff within the Lord of the Rings itself that are songs and stories, and Gil-galad was an elven king, of him the harpers sadly sing, sort of thing. So there's all kinds of little bits and tidbits of things throughout the books as well that they have access to. But I think that just everybody enjoy it for what it is. I think.
Yeah.
I did tell Sarah before we started today that I'm hoping that the Rings of Power is more the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings than it is the Peter Jackson The Hobbit. So I have certain misgivings about The Hobbit, shall we say.
Yeah.
But so one of the things we wanted to do today was sort of look at some world building in fiction to start with, and some of the classics that are out there, where they sort of got their ideas, and then giving people a little bit of ideas of the mechanics of what go into world building and creating a believable world. So the three big classics that I wrote down were, of course, The Lord of the Rings and Dune for sci-fi. That's like the quintessential classic for sci-fi world building. And then even Watership Down. Watership Down is one of those books that I think you even mentioned this in one of yours recently as well.
Yeah.
So there's not a long appendix in here, but there is indeed a glossary of Lapine in the back. So the rabbit language, the Richard Adams actually came up with some vocabulary, but it's a self-consistent world. So it makes sense from the rabbit's perspective. You don't get pulled out. And one of the things we were talking about before we started talking today was the fact that if you're reading fantasy or reading sci-fi or even a historical fiction or historical romance or something, you don't want something in there that's going to pull you out of the story.
Right.
So one of the things I think that we even talked about before we started was the whole idea you don't want to be in a medieval type setting and then have somebody pull out a cell phone or something like that. That's one of the things that's really going to pull you out of the story, and then it's going to be disconcerting. I mean, maybe if they can fold it in the narrative later on or something, and then it's like, oh, and then you can go back and say it makes sense. But you don't want something that's going to be so jarring it's going to take you out of the story and not have it explained or something like that.
Right. Or a magical system that works for these things but doesn't work for other things, or they could use the spell easily later and they don't.
Exactly. The magical systems are an interesting jumping off point, because I think that there's so many, there's the hard magic and the soft magic and that sort of thing. And I think that Tolkien's been described as a soft magic system where you don't really see a lot of overt magical spells and that sort of thing, as opposed to Harry Potter, where that's
saying specific words for specific things instead of Gandalf just.
Exactly. And so I think that it's interesting to just think about any number. And I will say that we have, of course, Lord of the Rings, Watership Down, Dune. I went and looked at the appendices for both the Lord of the Rings and for Dune, and the appendices. And since this is just 1/3, so there's 127 pages of appendices in this. There are 42 pages of appendices in the back of Dune, all about the chronologies and the glossary and the religion systems and all that sort of thing. But I think what's interesting too to keep in mind is that the author needs to keep all that stuff in mind, but you don't have to make it,
or so complex that you just have to put down the book because you don't care about the characters.
Exactly. Yeah. You don't want the backstory to override the characters, the narrative, that sort of thing. If you have that sort of story where it's been described as the author, did so much homework that there's like, here, let me show you my work, that sort of thing. It's like, yeah, we don't want to see that.
Right.
That's okay.
Right.
So yeah, keep that to yourself. But I've always liked the fact that Tolkien put so much work into it and felt the need to sort of show his work, but not have it override the narrative. It's like if you're interested in this stuff, here's like 7 or 8 appendices in the back of the book in the index, that sort of thing. But the narrative itself, sort of goes along. Same way with Dune. Everything is sort of in the background. And then if you want to read the appendices, you can. If you don't want to read the appendices, you don't have to. So I think that that's a nice way to assuage people's curiosity if they are curious about the backstory.
It's not taking away
but
from
not taking away from the continuity of the story and pulling you out of that way. Because that's another way you can get pulled out of a narrative as well. I mean, if you get a lot of exposition, it's like 4,000 years before the events of it's like, no, we don't care.
Nope, don't care. Let's get
and
going.
Skip to page. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a really interesting way to, I think the author has to do their work. You have to recognize that they've done their work, because what you want in a story is some depth to the narrative, to the story, and have the characters know what's going on, but you don't have to know everything and every minute detail of every history book that's in the world. So.
Definitely.
One of the things along those lines, I will take the opportunity to tout John Scalzi anytime I can, since he's also an Ohio author.
Well, yeah.
And so Old Man's War is the classic that John Scalzi wrote a number of years ago. This is another logically consistent world, but he doesn't hit you over the head with it. So everything it's like, as you're reading, everything, makes sense. It's weird, but
That's okay.
But it makes sense at least. And the same way with his most recent trilogy. This is The Collapsing Empire. I believe this is the first book in the series. Again, this is a really cool, consistent world. Lots of stuff going on. But again, he's obviously, charted out, how he wants things to go, how who's related to who, and how the technology works and all that sort of thing. But he's not going to hit you over the head with it.
Right,
So
right.
that's the kind of thing that I think really. So the author has obviously done his work, but he hasn't. You don't have to read every note that he's made himself. So. And one of the things I think is interesting too, as far as world building goes, is that we have a number of books in the library that have to do with world building itself. And I just pulled a few that specifically talk about that. So just to sort of give people an idea, if you are an aspiring author yourself, you are welcome to take advantage of some of these things. So the things about, so a writer's guide to create a science fiction universe is one. And this will go through, ice ages and all that sort of thing, and how you can put those things into your work and know what's going on. We have world building, a writer's guide to constructing star systems and life-supporting planets, which is kind of cool.
Love it. I want to read this and I don't write.
Exactly. And this one is actually from 2018, so fairly recently, a collaborative world building for writers and gamers. And this is another thing, if you are like at Dungeons and Dragons or something like that, you can create your own worlds in that way. You don't have to worry about writing narrative stories, but you have to construct a world that makes sense and your people are going to want to play in and that sort of thing. So I think that's an interesting way to go as well. We also have Aliens and Alien Societies, a writer's guide to creating extraterrestrial life forms. This is another one of those things, if you want to have bipedal lizards in your world, you need to figure out, what's their government going to be like? What are they going to be do they still have to sun themselves to get going in the day? Do they have to, what's their writing system like? What's their language like? How are their mouths constructed? All this sort of thing. And again, you want to answer those questions for yourself, but you don't necessarily have to say the mechanics of your lizard mouths to all of your readers. So they'll pick up on it.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing to take into account if you are creating a world, either for a book or for a game, or even just for your own, as a hobby, you can look at different ages and different societies and that sort of thing. So we have everyday life in the Middle Ages, so you can pick and choose what you would want to include in your world there. There is a writer's complete fantasy reference. So this one actually has an introduction by Terry Brooks. And this is, the subtitle is an indispensable compendium of myth and magic. So I think that this is a way that you can also, so that just to give you an idea of some of the things in the fantasy references, that we're looking at traditional fantasy cultures. So they go through feudalism and political entities, world cultures, magic, witchcraft and pagan paths, commerce, trade, and law in contemporary fantasy, fantasy races. So we have the dwarves, the elves, the giants, the goblins, halflings, creatures of myth and legend. You can look at different myths and legends and see what you want to incorporate into your writing as well. Dress and costume, how do people dress? So even those kinds of things. I mean, if you have somebody who's, say they wake up in the morning and they're getting dressed, what kind of clothes are they maybe putting on? Is it the typical sci-fi jumpsuit, or is it, that kind of thing? What do they sleep in? What do they wear on their feet? If they're trudging through the mud, what do they have to do to get rid of the mud?
They have to stay warm.
Exactly. Fair. Oh, well done.
See?
If they're lizards, they have to stay warm. See. Then they went on the hunts for the fur-bearing animals of the north, so they can make their clothes. And there you go. Then arms and armor, all kinds of different fighting systems and that sort of thing. And of course, the anatomy of a castle is the final one here. So, where do they live?
I have to point out, Sherilyn Kenyon is a romance author.
You are correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah, you definitely need, and she's paranormal mostly, but it's a little bit of Viking.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
So,
And that's, I think, really the case, that I think a lot of these sorts of things do lend themselves to romance, to historical fiction, to sci-fi, to fantasy, all those sorts of things. So the research, I mean, you listen to some of the authors on YouTube and things like that, or read the work that they put into the backstories.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's true crime and that sort of thing. They're not true crime, but like crime and detective novels and that sort of thing. You got to do your homework, and poisons and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And this makes me think of Outlander too, which is historical fiction. When she first goes back, they talk about what she gets dressed in the next day because she doesn't have clothes. So she's how many layers of clothes she's putting on and describing all of them, and like how Jamie, wraps his kilt, things like that. It's really cool to learn.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the kind of thing I think if an author can include those kinds of details within the narrative structure,
it makes it so much better. Because instead of saying, Jamie, in my mind, I just think, oh, it's just like a pleated thing, and no, it's one big piece of fabric, and you wrap it and do all this,
wrap it,
and it's really cool. So.
Yeah, and I actually, she was one of the ones that came up whenever I was doing some research for world building and stuff. Hers, the Outlander series, was one of the book series that says, she does a good job of putting you in that time period.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's a way that, again, that even if your world building, I think, can be historical too, because since we don't live in that time period anymore, you have to put people in that mindset. So I think that's one of the ways that it's, sort of interesting that, even if you're just writing historical fiction, you have to do your homework. I mean, unless you just don't care and it's if they don't want to do that, but then I think it comes across. I would assume it would also come across in the writing as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if an author doesn't care enough to get it right, then it's like
research.
So I think that's one of the interesting things that is available there. But I really like the idea of if you are world building. I talked about conlanging last episode a little bit. You can look at all the different linguistic textbooks. You can look at all the different languages, see what you like there. You don't even have to come up with a full-fledged language, but if you are going to have your aliens or your people in another fantasy world or that sort of thing, if you're going to use some vocabulary, you at least have to be consistent again. You can't use sounds that don't seem to go together. You want people to at least think that you're having that. And that's one of the interesting things about Tolkien. I mean, the whole idea of the Lord of the Rings grew out of the fact that he created languages and wanted a world for them to be spoken in. That was the reason that he wrote the books. So the languages came first, and then the story came after that. And he looked at Welsh, he looked at Finnish, he liked bits and pieces of that, and that's how he started building those languages. But I think that it's really cool that that was sort of the genesis of the whole thing. And it can be different entry points for different authors too. I mean, authors, they might really want to explore a time period. They might want to explore, a specific, sort of technology, especially with sci-fi. But again, I think it has to be that consistent narrative throughout that doesn't pull you out of the thing. I do think it's interesting too that if we talk a little bit about the difference between reading a book and building that visual world in your head, and then also looking at it as a film or a TV series. This, I think, is where it really comes in for people who get, an idea in their head and it's like, oh, that's not what that's like. And it's like,
right, that's not how I had it in my head. And then there's people, I don't know, I always picture big elaborate things when I'm reading, but I know there's people who, when they read art, don't picture things like that. That's just not the way that they would process it too.
Exactly. So. I think that's one of the reasons I'm such a slow reader, because I have to construct the whole scene in my head. It's like, well, what are they wearing? What are they wearing?
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the things. And I will say, I even have in my notes here that as far as the Lord of the Rings, like I said, I was a nerd since high school. But I will tell you that Gandalf is Ian McKellen and Ian McKellen is Gandalf at this point. So
I don't think there's any.
There's like no way around that.
And then if you go from there, like I was saying, Sam is, there's no way it's, and I can't think of his name, the actor's name who played.
Oh, Sean Astin?
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so good. So, and then if you just go from there, you pretty much can't recast anybody.
Exactly. Legolas and the whole,
Aragorn.
Yep. Exactly.
And then kind of, I think it's interesting too. So that was so well adapted, so well loved. Let's compare it to things that aren't as well adapted. And sometimes I do have trouble describing it. Like, how do you describe it? An example for me was the Wheel of Time show, which was really well done in the way that it looked great. It was interesting how they made choices, but I didn't feel much for the characters.
I agree.
So what's that missing bit that didn't get in there, and how? What is? I can't describe it. So
exactly. And are you a fan of the Wheel of Time books?
I've done 5 of them. Yeah.
There's 27?
Oh gosh, so many. Brandon Sanderson just kept it going. So yeah, I am very behind, but enough read enough of them to know, that I should
I feel the same way.
care somewhat about these characters. So, I want to know what that missing ingredient is. So.
I fully agree. I got the same. I have not read the books yet, but I know exactly what you mean about getting pulled into the story. It was like, it was like, okay. It's like,
say
it was
like
one
The
of the things
Hobbit.
yeah. Oh.
Like just same people, same, a lot of things, but don't care as much.
No,
doesn't have the rewatchability. Doesn't
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
So-
Exactly. It's all. It seems to me it's all about the narrative structure and really caring about the characters. And I think that the acting was fine in The Wheel of Time.
Yeah.
But it's just not. Yeah, I don't know what it was. I told Sarah before we started today that I walked out of my first screening of The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, and I was almost crying because like they read my mind, man. So it really fit the level of detail that they went into for creating the visuals and everything for that, and the script and everything was just spot on as far as that for that very first Peter Jackson film. So I thought that was the way to go.
And I think now with so many adaptations, I think studios think we'll just dump a bunch of money into it and a bunch of effects, and people will love it. And it's not the case because we can tell the difference.
Exactly.
Sometimes can't always describe it, but
exactly.
And even something that you love, which for me would be Game of Thrones, and I loved the books and read them, and the show, really loved it, and then it just got very disappointing.
Yes. Season 8.
I know. So we'll see. I've only watched the first 2 House of the Dragon episodes and trying to reserve.
And excuse my
judging too
ignorance,
much.
but is the House of the Dragon based? Did he write those books as well? Are those extant?
I think they're just screenplays. Yeah.
Okay.
It may be based off shorter things, and I don't know, but I think it's just pulling from.
Okay.
Yeah. As far as I know.
Yeah, and that'll be interesting to see how that all plays out, because I find it really interesting that the Rings of Power and the House of the Dragon are coming out exactly the same time. It's like,
Yeah, they'll be on this.
It's almost like somebody planned it. I don't know.
To have 2 big blockbusters up against each other and rival streaming services.
And I did think it was interesting too. We talked briefly about the whole idea of born visual things too, specifically the Sandman. And I thought that it's been a really interesting. Have you watched the?
I haven't watched all of it, just the first episode.
Okay.
So
I watched all the episodes, and I was initially somewhat trepidatious whenever I heard they were playing it, but whenever I found out that Neil Gaiman was actually the showrunner of the whole thing, and I've seen things online where they will show pictures from the comics pages and pictures from the TV series, and it's literally a 1-to-1. It's almost like they use the comics as a storyboard. So whenever you have Neil Gaiman on there and you use the comics as a storyboard, chances are it's going to be pretty good. But again, vitriol online, somebody changed something, and oh my heavens, and this person is a person of color and they weren't in the thing, and and I'm like, they're still great. Death is awesome in the new TV series. So she does an excellent job. But that whole thing about that, you can still have an idea in your head of what these characters look like, even whenever it's a born visual medium like a graphic novel. So I think it's really interesting that people can really get entrenched in. It's like, this is the only way it can be.
Right.
I think we had a couple other ones that are coming out recently.
Yeah. So I was looking up some other ones. I did want to mention Stranger Things, and then also Paper Girls, which are from similar time periods, but definitely still a little different vibes for both of those. And then coming up, Disney Plus, Andor, which is Cassian Andor.
Oh, that's right.
And
that's another
Rogue One.
That's another interesting world building theory with Star Wars. I mean, they have the whole Star Wars and the Wikipedia and all that kind of stuff that is just everybody's 6 degrees from this person, and so there's a lot of behind the scenes. And I'm curious as to, I can't remember, but how much they kept that as canon whenever Disney took it over. There was some sort of brouhaha. I remember that they didn't keep all the backstory.
I'm a fan, but not.
Yeah, that seems to know like, that. Yeah, that's quite all right. Neither am I. I'm aware of it, but I can only have one deep fandom at a time.
That's okay. That's okay. And then Willow on Disney Plus, which is one of my favorite movies of all time.
Yes.
It's fantastic. If you haven't seen it, you couldn't stream it for a long time. And I think when Disney decided to do it, of course, so it just magically ended up. So it's on Disney Plus now. If you don't know Val Kilmer in his heyday, I would go back and watch it.
I'd forgotten about that one. That's great.
Man, he's good. Dune, The Sisterhood, which I didn't know till I was reading about upcoming shows. So hopefully next year, HBO Max, it's going to be the Bene Gesserit prequel.
Oh, really?
Which I'm really excited about. Yeah. So
okay. I was even unaware of that one myself.
I know. Mandalorian season 3. That'll be February of next year. And then Wool, which I never read, by Hugh Howey. Apple TV bought it. And Rebecca Ferguson, she was in a lot of things. She was in the Shining sequel movie, which I can't think of, Dr. Sleep. She was the villain. She was really good. She was also Paul's mother in the new Dune. So she's great. So I'm excited about that too.
I haven't read Wool, the Wool series myself either, but my wife read them and she was a big fan. She ripped through all of them. So
now it's a reason for us to read them.
Yes, indeed. So I didn't realize that one was coming to TV as well. I think that's one of the things that it's a big responsibility, I think, for producers and directors to bring these books that people really have they got an idea in their head of how things should be. And so you're really playing with fire.
Right. You might as well just come up with your own sci-fi universe. It might be easier than
hard.
It is hard. Or everyone would do it.
Story? It's like we got to do a whole story ourselves. Oh my gosh. But I forgot about. I had not heard about Wool. I was not aware of the Sisterhood, the Sisterhood coming out.
Yeah, because you don't really know. They're still mysterious. There's not much about them.
Exactly, and that was one of the things. I know there was a little bit of a brouhaha whenever they started coming out with the prequel books to Dune. That everybody's like, it's like, oh, and they changed some things that people I think thought were supposed to be. And I'm like, oh my heavens, wow. It's like it's still a fictional world. As much as I love Tolkien, it's still a fictional world.
Right.
You gotta have a little bit of perspective there and sort of like take it with a grain of salt. But I will say that I was extremely skeptical of the Rings of Power whenever I first heard about it. I was like, oh, okay. But then they came out with the first promo image in Valinor with the 2 trees, and I was like, oh, they've done some homework. Okay, now I can get excited. So,
and what do you think of the trailer?
I'm cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic. And so I think the whole Meteor Man thing, I'm still a little. I will go on record right now that I say that it's Gandalf. For any of you out there that watched the trailer for the Rings of Power, the Meteor Man is Gandalf. So that's
Sauron.
But of course, that will be, I guess, revealed in the next and throughout I believe 5 seasons they've signed up for, something like that.
Nice.
So I think that's already on the book. So we will see what actually comes of it. But I will go on record and feel free to excerpt this out and play it to me later on whenever I'm proven wrong, or better yet, I'll do it when I'm proven right. So how about that?
Remember.
Well, those are some great series, and the whole idea, the Paper Girls too, is of course by Cleveland author, and so that sort of thing. So Ohio has such a tendrils in everything. I think that's just amazing. But the Dune, I'm cautiously optimistic too about the Sisterhood. That is going to be interesting. So that is based on one of the prequel novels. Do you know?
I'm assuming I didn't. There wasn't much information about it. So yeah.
Okay. So I think that so I guess the takeaways today from our little conversation are, if you have any favorite novels that have really good world systems built into them, feel free to drop us a comment on Facebook. If you are a Tolkien nerd, I'm assuming you all know what El Encilo Luminum and Tielvo means, so we'll leave that hanging out there as well. And I think that it's just a fun way to really get behind the scenes of some novels that you like. Again, I don't think that the reader is the one that should have to do the homework whenever you're reading a novel.
You don't want it
to
feel like homework.
Just sort of wash over you, and you sort of learn things as you read. And I think your example of the Outlander episodes were actually spot on, because I think that sort of thing, that having it actually be part of Claire's getting ready for the day sort of thing, and just having her reaction to that. And so it would be such a better way if she had to wear this and had to wear this.
Yeah, let's
a bulleted list, of things that were like, here is the costume that they had to wear. It's like no. But having it do that's why she's a good writer.
Exactly.
That's why she has a fandom. So thank you all for joining us on our little trek through Middle Earth and Dune and a couple other worlds here today. Please feel free to drop us a comment, like I said, and we will see you next time on Book Drops. Thank you very much for joining us.